Amen. Thank you, Bob, for reading the scripture for us and for that short introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm Monica Miller, and I recognize a couple of names from Christmas Eve. It was wonderful to have a few of you with us for that service. And I'm really excited to be able to worship with you this morning and that you've loaned Craig to us for a morning. And yeah, would you pray with me as we dive in this morning? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. Who knows? I imagine those were the words ringing in Esther's ears as she wrote her own death sentence with every step she took. Who knows? Every footfall echoed louder and louder as she neared the inner court uninvited. Who knows? Her heart felt like it was pounding outside her chest. Her hammering heartbeat threatened to drown out the words. Who knows? She rounded the last corner, no turning back now. Who knows? She could see through the doorway, the king on his throne. Who knows? Was she stepping into mercy or her grave? Who knows? She crossed the threshold. And there, in suffocating silence, one moment felt like a lifetime. A hair's breadth between life and death, which would come, who knows? And Esther aged 100 years in the second it took the king to react. He extended his scepter, mercy, not death, and the world sighed in relief. The book of Esther is not for the faint of heart. As entertaining as Esther's story is, and it really is a masterful work of storytelling, a careful reading will allow the deeper, heavier themes to seep into the pits of our stomachs. This sermon is about glass ceilings and genocide, though I have spoiled the ending already. Esther lives. And for her, glass ceilings are a problem of her womanhood, and genocide is a problem of her ethnicity as a Jewish woman. And those are two pieces that we'll pay attention to as they intersect with her life in the palace. But before we lose too much momentum, let's dive back in, but rewind a little bit. How did we get to this point? Ahasuerus was king of Persia. And if you want to get technical, his name was Ahashverosh. Some translations call him Artaxerxes or just Xerxes. I'm sticking with Ahasuerus. And after a very public fiasco with the former queen Vashti, Ahasuerus goes on the search for a new queen. And the king's officers round up many teenage girls, including Hadassah, who we know later as Esther. And they seize these girls from their homes and cart them off to their palace. This was not a voluntary beauty pageant. This was human trafficking. And after a year of being groomed, Hadassah pleases Ahasuerus the most, so she becomes the new queen. And the rest of the girls don't get to go back home. They are added to the king's house of concubines. So all of the girls involved have to begin brand new lives in the palace. But then a few years pass, and we find that the Jewess Esther, as she is now known, has been successfully passing as Persian this entire time. Fortunately for her, female bodies do not bear any marks of Jewish ethnicity. So what kind of code switching does she need to do? She can't openly worship Yahweh. She can't eat kosher. She doesn't observe the Sabbath or the Passover or any other Jewish holy days. To pass in the palace for that long, she can't just distance herself from her culture. She has to abandon it altogether. So she rejects the essence of her sense of self as a survival tactic. She negates her culture and her people to embody an identity foreign to herself in order to survive, which tells you that being Jewish may have been a liability. But even as the queen of the most powerful empire on earth, she doesn't feel safe in her Jewish skin. And she has to live this false self, this alienated existence, this capitulation to the dominant center of power, foreseeably for the rest of her life. The king's newly appointed right-hand man, Haman, now how he got that position, we don't actually know. His qualifications are either non-important or non-existent. But Haman immediately has an incident with Mordecai, orphan Esther's former guardian, also a Jew. And well, that escalates quickly, and a proclamation issues forth from the palace that on one specific day, anyone can rob and kill any Jew they can find. And the news of this proposed genocide does not go over well in the scattered Jewish communities. And to show the seriousness of his grief, Mordecai wears sackcloth, he pours ashes on his head, an outward sign of the knots in his stomach and in his soul, as if the weeping and wailing wasn't sign enough. And he goes to the palace gate like he sometimes does, and Esther, through her servants, asks him what's wrong. Queen Esther doesn't know about the proclamation of genocide against her own people. The city of Susa is in an uproar about it, but the palace is quiet and calm. Insulated by the palace walls and isolated from her Jewish heritage, Esther is out of touch. Her proximity to power distances her from the margins that she grew up in. And if it wasn't for Mordecai's show of grief, she would have never known about the genocide. But now Esther's life is threatened. I preach this sermon as a white woman, and those two words, white woman, contain a mixture of power and marginalization that makes navigating power dynamics responsibly a little messy. When do I stand up for myself, and when do I sit down? When do I speak up, and when do I listen? When do I lead, and when do I follow? And for myself as a white woman, it's a complicated mess, but that's just talking about race and gender. What about class, education, citizenship, sexual orientation, physical or mental ability, or even just the roles within our families, our workplaces, and congregations? Living a responsibly powered life, one that can differentiate between oppressive power and liberating power, is messy. And I see some of that messiness at play in Esther too, because we have Esther, a woman, ethnically other, but she is queen of the largest empire the world had ever seen at that time. She was the most powerful woman on earth politically. So we left Mordecai outside the gate in sackcloth and ashes, and Esther in the palace is communicating with him via a servant. And Mordecai says, Esther, this is our death warrant. You need to talk to the king about this and get him to stop it. And Esther fires back, there's a glass ceiling in this palace and you know it. We don't usually think of the term glass ceiling with regard to monarchies and kings and queens. It's usually more of a corporate ladder that you can, or rather can't, climb. But I think some similar underlying prejudices and gender-based barriers may be at work here too. Between the lines of chapter 4, verse 11, Esther says, Haman goes to talk to King Ahasuerus whenever he wants, even uninvited in the middle of the night. And that is about to happen in 2 chapters. But if anyone else, including me, the queen, tries to talk to the king without an invitation, we die, unless the king extends his golden scepter. Mordecai, it's not within my power to do what you're asking me to do. I may be the top ranking woman in the empire, but unlike the top male officials, I can't talk to the king, my husband, uninvited. That is above my pay grade. And this is Mordecai's response. Don't think that because you're in the palace, you'll escape this. Don't think that the palace will make an exception for you. Don't think that your Persian mask will save you. If you stay silent in the face of this injustice, our deliverance will have to come from somewhere else. And then your proximity to our executioners will speak louder than your Jewish ancestry. So how would you rather die? Trying to save your own skin or trying to save your people? Stuck between a rock and a hard place, Esther is trapped between a glass ceiling and a genocide. At once declared not worthy of life because of her ethnicity, yet her political position places her within reach of those who make such judgments. Parts of Esther's identity place her on the receiving end of systemic violence, but parts of her identity place her on the dealing end of that violence. And now she's stuck. She is staring down the barrel of the gun of empire, but her queenly office puts her finger on the trigger. Something's got to give. None of her options look good. And then something happens. We're not exactly sure what. But it's as though Esther, who had had life happen to her, is suddenly released to take the helm in what's going on. Who knows what could have happened to prompt that release? We don't know how long it took her to formulate her reply to Mordecai, but she comes to grips with the sobering reality that no matter what she does or doesn't do, her life will likely end quite a bit sooner than she had imagined. And rather than fall victim to genocide, she takes control and chooses to go out on her own terms. Esther hatches a plan and starts issuing orders. She mobilizes the Jewish community in the city through Mordecai and her own community of maids in the palace to fast with her while she prepares to approach Ahasuerus in his inner court uninvited. Mordecai's last words to her were, "Perhaps this is why you've attained royalty." And in her final preparations that fateful morning, she clothes herself not with some particularly striking dress. The Hebrew word is more vague. She literally puts on royalty. And if Esther had been struggling to understand how and why she was in this queenly position, she takes ownership of it now. And perhaps the pieces are finally falling together for her as she begins her journey to the halls of power in the very heart of empire, with little choice but to face death. Each step of her march is a stride toward justice. Yet this is not some noble march that we should glorify. This is a march born of necessity, a march for the right to exist, a march that all evidence indicates will fail. Oh, that she had never needed to march. The book of Esther never once mentions God. Many scholars point to the Jews' deliverance from another place that Mordecai talks about and say, that's God. And other scholars disagree. But there are two words that I left out of my paraphrase of Mordecai a minute ago. Two words that come right before his famous "for such a time as this" line. Who knows? And as Esther wrestles with the decision of how she would rather die, her fate may look like it's sealed, but who knows? And as she weighs the impossibility of overcoming the barriers of the law, her glass ceiling may look impenetrably thick, but who knows? And as she takes her stand at the nucleus of imperial power, it may look like it will crush her alone, but who knows? That question, who knows, leaves open a divine hope, a divine possibility, a divine open-endedness that my seminary chaplain once put it so well. It doesn't have to be this way. To ask who knows is to refuse to accept injustice as it stands because it doesn't have to be this way. And to ask who knows is to reject the dominance of domination because it doesn't have to be this way. And to ask who knows is to acknowledge the fact that oppression has an upper hand, but not the upper hand, because we know it doesn't have to be this way. Even if God is never mentioned, even if God is impossible to see, it doesn't mean that God is absent, because we know the name of God, and it's Jesus Emmanuel, God with us. And Emmanuel was born so very far from the halls of power, so may my whiteness tremble, but my womanhood rejoice, that in the face of violence and oppression, it doesn't have to be this way. So may we join in the long struggle against the odds with hope, because with Emmanuel in the game, who knows?